Okay, so today is Friday, February 18th. My name is Vivian Zhang. I'm an intern at the Houston Asian American Archive, and I have the privilege of interviewing Ms. Dea Chinquanco, who has many things in her life that she's involved in and who has a great life story that she's going to be adding to the archive. So just to start off, Ms. Chinquanco, where and when were you born?
I was born in Manila, Philippines on January 20th, 1974.
And could you describe kind of like the household and the environment that you grew up in?
Sure. I grew up in a household with my father, my mother in Manila, and my older brother, Albert Chinquanco, who we traveled quite a bit with my father being an executive for a company. And so within the Philippines, we traveled locally. We were moved around quite a bit, changed schools and whatnot. And then, later on, we emigrated to the US with our mother only.
Mm. How would you describe like the neighborhood you grew up in, or like what kind of memories did you have from being a kid?
Gosh, quite a lot actually, because again, from moving around, we of course started off in Manila, which is supposed to be the New York City of the Philippines, right? And so big city, very busy, a lot of jeepneys and tricycles around, buzzing around. You can hear traffic, from inside your home because homes are quite close to each other. The streets are quite accessible, right? So you can step right outside of the gate and the main roads are there right away. It's kind of, if you picture, I guess, a bustling city street in Asia, that would be what you would expect. Interestingly enough, it's kind of a mixed bag. There's very nice developments, very nice buildings, also mishmashed with a lot of shanties, areas with squatters, in the community. And of course, growing up when you haven't seen anything different, that looks normal, right? But
Mm.
of course, once you start traveling and viewing things differently, you do see the differences. We used to travel, so we did get moved into the provinces in the Philippines, and those areas are a lot more quiet. There's definitely more vegetation, more trees and greenery, fresher air, which is quite nice. We moved to a beach town when I was a young girl in Cebu, as a young girl, and our parents used to take us to the beach every weekend, and they would grill fresh seafood, and we would eat with our hands on banana leaves. Those are very treasured memories for me as a child. Especially as adults now, we tend to we dream about those simple yet luxurious, I would say, experiences now, right? Finding very pristine beaches that are very clean and unruined, really. Yeah. So
Mhm.
I hope that sort of paints a picture of the variations of of the topography of the land. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. What were some of like the values that your parents emphasized in you as a child?
Apologies for that dinging there. Values, family, definitely, spirituality,
Mm.
um, and most definitely, just a dignity for as humans and for us towards ourselves and each other. Those were very much ingrained um, to us as children growing up. You know, and we received a lot of guidance, not just from our parents but our grandparents as well. So family is defined not just as the nuclear but also as the extended family, and that
Mhm.
goes, it extends to cousins and aunts and uncles and such, and so, having been, I am so sorry about that. Um, Trying to see how I can shut it down, but, but, yeah, so those family extensions really instilled a lot of those values, most definitely in me as I was growing up.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you moved to the US with your mother. How old were you when this happened? Like, where did you move to?
Um, I moved to here into Houston at the age of 14 years old. Um, my parents, unfortunately, and maybe fortunately, actually, they ended up. It was a very rare situation at the time, especially coming from the Philippines as a Roman Catholic, growing up as a Roman Catholic. My parents ended up separating, and so my mother, my grandfather, let me back up a little bit, but my grandfather was a veteran, and in fact received medals of honor, the Purple Heart and the Silver Star, because of World War II. And so she then came to the US, and because of hardship, really, as a single parent, or a separated, at least a broken family, economically was having a hard time. And so she pursued opportunities here in the US. And when I turned 14, she had my brother and myself move here along with her. It was just the three of us here in Houston at the time. Mhm.
What was your first impression of Houston?
As I described to you, coming from Manila, which is a bustling city,
Mhm.
looking outside the window of the airplane, first of all, is just how flat
Yes.
it was at the time, or is still is, but
Yes.
of course we have a lot of development now, and so
Mm.
even though it's flat, you've got our highway systems and whatnot, but at the time when we landed at IAH, it was very flat, a lot of greenery, a lot of grass, and so my very first impression was, where did we move, and what's going on? It's very, there's not much going on. This was my impression.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
which was surprising because, I always had, visualizations of the United States from Manila in a very, developed kind of way. But, of course, we used to watch movies and would see, New York City, for example, which is, like, tons of buildings and, high rises and whatnot. Not that that didn't exist in Houston, but it was the first thing that I saw. So, mhm.
What were like, did you have any culture shocks or like any kind of just, yeah, like shocks coming from Asia, like immigrating, especially at like 14? I think you're probably like eighth or ninth grade.
Interesting. So, going through schooling in the Philippines, when I arrived here, and my mother enrolled us for high school, I was already supposed to be an incoming junior
Oh,
in high
wow. Okay.
school at the age of
Yeah.
14. And
Oh.
so thankfully the counselor, of course, at that time I felt a bit uh not shafted, but sort of, a little bit displaced, because in my mind, yeah, I'm supposed to be a junior incoming already, but the counselor had advised my mother that I needed to start at sophomore year at the age of
Mhm.
14, because I was just too young for my peers.
Mm.
And what a wise advice, really, from the counselor. And so
Mhm.
that's what happened. But going back to the culture shock, um, Yes, because we hadn't met any friends, or much of the, our peer group, age group at the time.
Mhm.
We probably had just been in town like a few weeks or something, and we were watching the news. And unfortunately, at the time, there were local news about skinheads, um,
Mm.
and they were wearing, I guess, emulating some of what the Ku Klux Klan used to wear. I
Yeah.
laugh now, but when I first arrived and saw that, I was very scared. I was terrified, and I told my mother, "This is local news. This is happening.
Mhm.
These, this." The imagery of the people we're seeing here are people sort of my age, if not a little bit older. They're probably like in their, you know, teens, like 17, 18 or whatnot. I'm seeing on television, and they are specifically um, have supremacist type of ideologies,
Yeah,
in
it's scary.
1989,
Uh-huh.
So my brother and I were, quite frankly, we were afraid, we were scared.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
then my mother was like, "Oh, don't worry about that too much," just kind of just waved it off. And I'm sitting here going, "It's in the local news,"
Yeah, yeah. That is
so
scary for sure. Yeah.
yeah. And then and then we were here. So we essentially had to just say, well, our mother says we're going to be fine. So okay, you know, moving on. So
Yes, yeah. Were
but
there like other Asians at your school, or was it very more predominantly white community?
no, you're right. There were not very many Asians. There, if I recall correctly, I was the only Filipina
Hmm.
at our school. There were some Vietnamese students whom I ended up hanging out with. They were welcoming, thankfully, um,
Hmm.
towards me. There were more at the high school at the time. There were predominantly more white students, um, blacks, and Hispanics. Um,
Hmm.
you know, Definitely the API community was not that huge yeah, in my high school years. Yeah.
Hmm. Did you ever face any sort of like racism or discrimination during that time because there were so few Asians?
Um, you know, I I felt a sense of otherness for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I at that age, when you're, at age 14, you don't quite, or I didn't at the time, really think of it that way. It was more of just I had moved from a different place, and I probably present very differently.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, you do feel, I wouldn't have described it as such at the time. Of course, as you understanding the way the society works and the lay of the land, and some of their experiences as time goes on, then you start to kind of put things together, right? But they were definitely more submersive, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
I do remember some comments that were made, right? Because I spoke English quite well already. Because in the Philippines, our education system, we are taught English from
That's
the
good.
very beginning, right? From preschool onwards. And so I spoke English very well. And so um, I would overhear things like, "Oh, uh, why can't the other Asians or whatnot sound more like Dea, who can speak English very well?" And essentially it's assimilated.
Yeah.
And even at that age, 14, I sat there and it felt off to me. Like I was like, that was not a compliment, you know. But now that I'm older, I can say that, right? That it was not a compliment.
Yes, yeah.
But when I was younger, it felt like it, but I didn't know how to articulate it. Does
Mhm.
that make sense?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on why it felt off.
Yeah, just that kind of comparison and like grouping all the Asians together.
Yeah, and also the fact that you'd have to sound that way, or you'd have to sound a certain way, or be a certain way to be more acceptable,
Mhm.
right? That was a very clear um, indication of that.
Mhm.
But of course, I was also a young teenager, and again, it felt off. I didn't know how to articulate it. Now that I'm a lot older, I'm getting close to my 50s. Now I can articulate it. I know what it is, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm. What was your mom's occupation when she moved to the US?
So my mother, she is an artist at heart. Um,
Mhm.
but growing up in the 50s, she was advised to take economics, for her college degree. So she got into banking. And so when she was employed in Manila, she was working for the Central Bank of the Philippines. And so when she came and moved here to the States, initially, she actually was having a difficult time finding an occupation in the banking system. So she was actually working retail.
Mm.
Um, she took retail jobs as a store clerk, things like that, until she was, I guess, able to build her resume. And so by the time we arrived here, um, we, she had a job at the bank. But prior to that, for some years, I would say maybe about 5 years, she did not actually have a proper career that was due her with her experience and her education level. So yeah.
Yeah.
But she was and even when she was working at the bank, she was working as a bank teller.
Okay.
Whereas in the Philippines, she was, definitely had a much more prominent role in the workplace. Yeah.
Mhm. I see. Were you close like with your brother during this time?
Yes, no, my brother and I have, growing up, we fought a lot,
Mhm.
but we were also very, very close. And I think having moved to a different country altogether, we made us very, very close. We very much realized early on that, we had to take care of each other. Yes.
Mm.
Yeah.
Is he younger or older?
He's older.
Oh, okay. That's good. So kind of moving on now to your college experience, what college did you attend and like why did you end up going there?
I started off at HCC at the Houston Community College. And really mainly because we financially could not afford we couldn't afford it. I could not go straight to, University of Houston, or, I, as much as I wanted to attend, possibly even like like an out of state, college, or a private college. There was just no means,
Mm.
financial means whatsoever. And so I started at HEC, and I would check the credits, the transferable credits and courses that would not, I wouldn't have any issue, right, transferring over to U of H.
Mhm.
I was very careful with that. And I literally took as much college credits as I could at HEC until I transferred over to University of Houston Central. And so I think I only had like one more, like 1 3-hour credit left before, like, would have maxed it out, yeah, until I transferred over to U of H. And so yeah, so and then after that, I transferred over to U of H, and got into the entrepreneurship program um,
Mhm.
at at the U of H and graduated from there. And then proceeded on with my work life. And then recently, I had the opportunity to finally, because it was on my bucket list, but to finally pursue my graduate studies. And so I got into Tufts, the Fletcher School of Tufts University in Massachusetts. Just finished that in September,
Oh,
actually.
wow, congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a brand new program for mid-career
Mm.
professionals, and it's a global business administration. So,
Wow, that's really cool. How did you go in undergraduate to decide to study like entrepreneurship and business?
oh gosh, that's a great question. I, which is, I would say now, uh, pretty quite natural for young people,
Yeah.
getting into college. It's okay not to be sure and not to know. It's we're growing, right? So I certainly went through that. I, being Filipina and having a lot of nurses and people,
Yeah.
Filipinos being in the healthcare industry, I thought it was almost kind of like you had to be, right? And so, but I would speak with the nurses in the community, and I would ask them questions. And the thing though is I already knew that I had no passion for it. I was like, I felt almost jealous because they were so passionate about it and were very proud of what they were doing. And I'm sitting there listening and I'm like, it's not for me, and so I then went and tried to pursue respiratory therapy instead. I said, okay, maybe this is more me, right? Yeah. And or maybe physical therapy was another thing. It was like always kind of still within the healthcare field, because I felt like there was like this is where we should go, right? And then when I got into respiratory therapy, I got through the track, and then I started going through clinicals at the hospitals, and very clearly I was just, no, this is not for me. So in midstream into the studies for that, I said no, this is not it. Went to U of H, was still trying to figure out, like, what am I going to do, right? And then looked into marketing, and communications, and I said, no, education. I worked for a Montessori school close by here where I live now, as an after-school teacher, because I thought I wanted to be a teacher. But then after doing that, I was like, no, this isn't it. And so I was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
And then I came across the entrepreneurship program, and I was uncertain, because taking entrepreneurship in of itself was a risk, because you're not quite specializing in accounting or finance or or marketing for that matter. It's all about uncertainty and risk taking. But it was the only thing that resonated with me, that felt right. So I said, this big uncertain thing is the only thing that feels right. So I said, it was it was nerve-wracking, right? Because like I said, we always had financial pressure in our household. And so, but at the end of the day, it was what felt right. And it was what felt, that fit. And so I said, I have to go with that. I have to go with that gut feel, right? Especially after having explored anyway. It's not like I was just doing guesswork and, like I worked at a school. I worked, I went through clinicals and I actually walked the walk and said, no, it is not working out here. Yeah. So
sometimes you just know, like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah. So
In college, do you think you had, do you think, what kind of communities were you involved in? Like, do you think you found more Asian communities that you might not have seen in your high school?
I did. And the it was such a huge blessing, and and again, in terms of finding your path, or finding what's right for you, and or the universe bringing it over to you, or praying about it, right? I actually found my band. uh,
Mm,
my brother actually was the one who found the band for me, a musical band. My brother became friends with this group of guys, and he ended up saying, okay, well, I'll help manage the band and promote it and whatnot, because they're a pop band, right, or alternative, or undefined, really. but so they ended up looking for female singers, right, because they were male led.
mhm,
And my brother said, well, my sister sings, and so I remember auditioning in the living room with the live. It's the first time I was in such close proximity to live instruments,
mm.
and instantaneously fell in love. I was just, I love this. This is great, and I I auditioned at the time. Lilith Fair was really huge with Sarah McLachlan. I don't know if you know who she is,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
she is the reason why female artists, musical artists, really had a template and a
Mhm,
voice and a stage all of a sudden. She really made a push for that at the time. So yeah, so I auditioned with one of her songs, and the guys were like, okay, sure, let's do this. But they were Filipino Americans born here in
yeah.
Houston. Or actually, no, well, it was a bit of a mix. Some of them actually grew up in Chicago and
Mm,
moved here in Houston, but Filipino American.
mhm,
Also, we had a really dear friend who we met at church in high school. It was one of our first friends. They had also moved from Manila here
mm,
to the US. And so one of the few, Asian American friends that we had made.
mhm,
And then slowly, getting into that community. But, at the university with a band, what was great, I got to tell you, is that it wasn't just AAPI. We were a very mixed group of friends. It
mhm.
was like United Colors of Benetton, during the 80s. We were very multicultural, and
Wow.
it was just a wonderful, wonderful time in my life. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to touch on that more a little bit later, but just going back to like your college experiences, what were some other defining moments that you think you had in college, whether it be about like your personal identity or just like your career, your education, and things like that?
Sure. So in terms of my identity, I remember we got involved in trying to figure out, like, how I'm trying to recall how I got pulled into this. But I just I always just noticed that even in the AAPI community, um, the recognition, for example, the Chinese community, the Japanese community, the Korean community, there was definitely more, I would say, representation and presence
Mm,
for them than Filipino Americans, or Filipinos, or Laotians or whatnot. And so in college, gosh, I'm sorry, I can't remember because it's so long ago, but I remember us producing a fashion show
mhm,
at U of H, and we were at the main. We were like in we had set up in one of the main by the UC at U of H,
mm,
um, and we set up a stage, and we featured Filipino traditional um, outfits, for this particular. And the impact for me was that after the fashion show, people actually came up and said, what is this? Like, where is this from? Right.
mhm,
Um, And from that point, I really realized that first and foremost is that, there really is still, at the time at least, and I think we're, a little bit more progressive than that now. But at the time, there was really a lack of understanding that even though we are Asians, that
Mhm.
we are actually coming from different parts of Asia,
Yeah.
different countries, right? Um, there's always just kind of a generalization, like I would, all people would always think that I was just Chinese, period. Right.
Mm.
And nothing wrong with that, by the way, but it's just at the same time, I'm like, well, I'm not though.
Yeah. Mhm. They're very different.
So, yeah, so certainly that was very, uh, came about pretty clearly, very early on, even in high school and of course, during college. In terms of, you were asking about career as well, the
Mhm. Just like any defining moments, yeah.
yeah. Well, having our our program at U of H at the time, I'm not sure if this is how they conduct their courses in the entrepreneurship track still, but it was interesting because we had two sets of professors per course. We
Mhm.
had the academic professors, and then we had essentially mentors and practitioners in real life that, that were business people, who would come in and speak with us. So that was a very impressionable for me in the sense that, yes, there's the theoretical, the modeling, those are all very important, and also then of course the application, the
Mhm.
practical application of these theories and these models and thought processes and strategies and whatnot. So that I felt was very impressionable for me to have been taught by both academics as well as practitioners, in college. And so I think that really throughout my career, throughout my learning, as I continue to push myself to grow, that's always in the forefront in my mind, right? Um, in terms of learning. So,
Yeah, that's really great. So yeah, just as a transition now into like your corporate career. So how did you like find work, or like what was your first job experience after you graduated from U of H?
when I graduated from U of H, I was working for a well, they weren't at the time. They used to be a wholesaler for the fashion industry.
Hmm.
But I was doing accounting work
Okay.
with them. And then when I graduated, I went on and I could continue doing that work, but they had also expanded into as a retail chain, a
Hmm.
privately held retail, a fashion chain. And so I remained with them doing, accounting work. Um, and afterwards, in my conversations with management at that time, I felt like there was no room for growth.
Okay.
Um, and so I decided to pursue other avenues. And so
Hmm.
I ended up interviewing for an international shipping company
Okay.
based here in Houston, Texas. They were a US firm, but was representing a German firm.
Okay.
So that was my introduction into the international shipping industry.
Yes. Your first job, was that the one at BBC, or was that something else?
Yes, it was with BBC Chartering.
Okay.
And I initially, so coming from the accounting, type of work, I ended up getting hired as a salesperson
Mhm.
for that company.
Mhm.
And, you know, it was very different, of course. I knew nothing about the industry. And so I had started on with them, and in my conversations with them, they also had a training program, typically with maritime graduates. They usually have a training, a kind of internship and training, um, um, you know, program in the company. But coming in as a professional, I then said, well, for me to do a good job selling the services of the company, I really could use the training. So I ended up sitting with the various departments of the company, a month at a time, just to absorb what they were, their functionality, as a group. And then I ended up uh, progressing on and becoming a manager for sales
Mm.
there. And then, luckily enough, I had a very good champion within the company, a Danish man whose name is Per Peterson, who I am very grateful for. It's almost like he was um, uh, he really paved the path for me in progressing with my career, because from sales, he then decided to sit me next to him and train me to become a broker and a trader.
Wow.
Mm.
Mhm.
So that really changed the trajectory of my career.
Yeah. So that's like about when you got into the international shipping industry, right?
Yeah, so BBC is an international shipping
Mm.
company.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I then from doing sales for them, I became one of the what they call a chartering broker.
Oh, okay. That's really
So it's a separate, so definitely it's separate, different skill set. It involves trading,
cool.
understanding, costs, um, and essentially, definitely still involving business development, uh,
Mhm.
client relations, but most certainly as a number one skill is negotiations. So
Mm.
yeah.
Okay. I know like you very very impressive resume. So can you
Oh,
talk a little bit
that's so
about
good.
like your yeah, just I know there's like so many things on your LinkedIn. I was like, there's so many things to talk about. But can you talk a bit about your next few like job positions? I think is that Bechtel and Dorco, is it?
Yeah, and so after some time, I actually was with BBC for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm.
After that, one of my clients was actually the EPC, Bechtel,
Okay.
and I ended up switching seats, doing chartering trading work
Mm.
uh, for the shipper, for the client. They
Okay.
were wonderful clients. And so I joined them, and, was in the same sort of work scope capacity for Bechtel. Um, the but what a wonderful opportunity to have been there, because I then was introduced to the inner workings of an engineering procurement construction company,
Mm-hmm.
and how they manage large projects, servicing oil majors, of course now energy more than oil, but but uh, but most certainly if you look at their website and the scope of work that they've done a lot of work in infrastructure building. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was then introduced to some of the intricacies of how managing such projects are, aside from the chartering work that I had been doing for the
Mm-hmm.
previous years, and still continue to do for them as a chartering broker, a chartering manager there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then after that, I had an opportunity to join another international shipping company, a carrier. So
Okay.
BBC was a carrier. I
Mm-hmm.
got pulled again into the carrier world.
Mm,
Thorco, which is a Danish company now.
wow.
So from German to Danish,
Uh-huh.
doing the same work. But here, in that post, I had the opportunity to get into management. And so I was hired on by the managing director, who was my colleague at BBC.
Mm, okay.
He then pulled me to be the right hand woman, for him
Mhm.
at this new office, here in Houston, because
Mhm.
again, it's a Danish firm. They had actually opened a couple of years, but were having a challenging time with the US
Mhm.
market. And so they hired on my colleague, and then my colleague then pulled me over and asked me to help build and manage the company and the brand, which we did a pretty good
Yeah.
job. Yeah, yeah,
Wow, that's really
yeah.
cool.
Thank you.
So
Yeah.
yeah, now like I know you're now working at a different company. So can you talk a little bit about your current job? Is it Mura?
Mhm. Okay, so after Torco, we
Yes.
actually had, I work for a very niche part of the international shipping community.
Hmm.
We focus in project work, and
Okay.
so anything that has to do with, international projects, infrastructure,
Mm.
like oil and gas, now renewables, but metals and mining, projects and things like that. And so there's a tendency for the industry to be a bit cyclical. So it goes up and down like this, right? So
Okay. Yeah.
we had an unfortunate instance where, of course, we were on a downturn, and basically the company offloaded, unfortunately, all the Americans. So we, we were let go as a group, as a unit.
Hmm.
Um, and then from there, I decided to go off on my own and start my consultancy. And that's what you mentioned, a Mira
Yeah.
project. Yeah. And so I had a great opportunity to work as a consultant with the skill set that I had acquired through, this career. And so I was able to work with initially the same capacity as a chartering,
Hmm.
uh, agent, broker for an oil and gas company, and then a company that they work with here. And then I also had the opportunity to work for a maritime law firm
Mm.
as an expert witness.
Oh, that's really
So yeah, it was a really cool experience. Yeah, because I got to do the work that I used to do as a practitioner more from an analytic
cool.
academic perspective. So
Mm.
I wasn't essentially moving large industry cargoes all over the place. I was more assessing a situation, making an analysis, and
Yeah.
essentially giving my recommendations. Yeah. So,
Mm.
and of course, working for the law firm as a consultant. So I got to do that, and then prior to taking this current post, I actually was also did some consulting work for
Mm.
a startup. They are actually Rice um, students, I believe, in the
Oh
master
wow.
program. Yeah,
Yeah.
they are involved in a geothermal startup.
Mm. Okay.
And
Wow,
so,
that's really cool.
yeah, they're,
Yeah.
I mean, Rice all over the place with with these folks. They're wonderful people. And
Mhm.
they are part of the Greentown Labs. And so I, I help them out with their RFP process, and also, just kind of holistically assisted them with the structuring of that. And it touched
Mm.
on marketing concepts, it touched on seed funding type of
Mm.
ideas and strategies. Great fun, great opportunity to be able to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually in the Jones Business School right now, so a lot of
Are
the
you?
innovation, yeah, it comes
Oh,
out of here.
beautiful. Yeah, no, it's good. My husband actually graduated from Rice with his master's and his MBA in
Mhm.
2010.
Oh
Um,
wow. Very
Yeah.
good.
So
How,
lots of
yeah. Mhm.
rice fans.
Yeah, love rice.
Yeah.
How has it been like dealing with like your consulting business and services during the pandemic? Because I know there's been some overlap.
Oh, for sure. It was challenging. In fact, I think that um, the pandemic really, first of all, I have an 8-year-old daughter, Emma,
Mm,
and so we had to keep her at home,
mhm.
or we chose to keep her at home. And so she was in first grade and she was taking classes via Zoom.
That's definitely difficult.
I mean, so she did amazingly. I was floored at how well she did.
Mhm.
But needless to say, of course, the dynamic of just all of a sudden needing to manage more at home, right? I then decided to uh, be very careful with the work that I did. And so I did uh, pull back a little bit on work. And that is when I decided to actually go to and take my graduate studies.
Mhm.
So while my daughter was studying, I went and decided to pursue my graduate
Yeah, yeah.
at the same time. So yes, it certainly affected the work that I was doing in terms of um, actual, consulting work with other clients.
Mhm.
So yeah, there was definitely a break there. Mhm.
Yeah. Are things a little bit better now, or is it mostly, I guess, with like international clients and people in different areas, it's kind of hard to be in person all the time. But do you think it's been improving in the past, I guess, 2 years now?
It is improving. And in fact, I think with the whole great resignation that's going on, and I actually, so I was, I'm working on a consulting basis, but just very recently, I've actually taken on a full-time role because
Mhm.
of the need
Mm.
for professionals going back. Especially in supply chain or anything logistics related. So yeah, and then of course, what I've noticed is that initially uh, it is very touch and go as far as having face-to-face time with people. But I think as the community has become, you know, more vaccinated, others have gotten sick as well, especially the Omicron. Um,
Mhm.
the uptick of people meeting together and
Mm.
trying to have face to face again is certainly happening more so now than even I would say even a month and a half ago. So
That's really great. Yeah. Um, I guess during all of your like career positions, have you been in Houston this whole time, or have you kind of been relocating, or do you travel a lot for your job?
I've always been based here in Houston. I used to travel quite a bit.
Mm.
I had the opportunity to travel for business in Europe, in South America, in Asia. Um, yeah, so in a lot of ways, especially being involved with the shipping companies
Mhm.
that's doing business, a lot of the work that I've done through the years, interestingly enough, because of course the pandemic showed us that we can do our work from home and our laptops and our phones.
Mhm.
Um, we've actually been doing work that way, for ever since, right? And so
Mhm.
I used to move a lot of large industry equipment all over the world, essentially from a laptop like this and phone calls and of course, yes, travels, just to build these relationships and have a better understanding of the landscape and the culture and the people and who you're dealing with and what they're dealing with, right?
Mhm.
So, but yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's great. Have you had any like significant mentors throughout your career?
plenty. I think, and both young and old, right?
Mhm.
I already mentioned my the person who trained me up, for the career that I am in right now. But it wasn't just him, right? There were other colleagues of mine, that certainly taught me, having gone back to school, of course, lots of different mentors, professors, even colleagues, right?
Yeah.
That have different sets of experiences in leadership and management, and strategy and approach in general. So a lot. I was very fortunate to have gotten the support of my professor in leadership development. So a colleague of mine, actually, we created a podcast as one of our projects for school, and the podcast is about global leadership. And so we were fortunate to have interviewed very admirable people. And so when you mention mentors, yes, Dean Rachel Kite, she is phenomenal. If you ever have the time, take a listen to that. Not for me, but because of her and what she has to say. Andy Valenciano, who is Foreign Trade Minister for Costa Rica. My colleague, Commander J.D. Christensen, who is in the U.S. Navy. Again, like there's just so many people. My husband, he's a very smart man, a very patient man. He's a great mentor for me. Always here to push me. Even sometimes I kind of get into that ageism thing where I'm like, I'm getting older, and he's just like, no, you're not done. You can do it, and, yeah.
Encouraging.
And younger friends, Roseanne Aragon is a really very she's a reporter for Channel 2. She's I would say she's probably young enough to maybe my eldest son is 24, so she's not that far in age with him, but I consider her as like a sister. We share a lot of thoughts, and so when you say mentors and guides, along the way, they come in so many different forms, ages and size, so yeah, I am very thankful for the people around me.
Yeah, that's definitely great. What do you enjoy most about kind of the field that you work in?
I enjoy the fact that because it is international, intrinsically you're going to deal with all kinds of people, many different countries. And the two things that I always end up savoring about the work that I do is in meeting these people is, one, always realizing that we're all the same, we're all human, but also respecting and enjoying the differences, right? And they're not always comfortable, but those differences really make everything so much more colorful. Otherwise it'd just be boring. So yeah, so I really enjoy having conversations about life and about work and about attitudes, from people of different cultures. So yeah, we're lucky that we get to do that with the work that we do. Yeah. So
what are some big lessons that you've learned throughout your career?
Oof, gosh, there's a lot. Number one is so we do, our work involves a lot of pressure. It's very fast paced. There's a lot of pressure. And it is true that we need to remember that in those times when situations are highly pressured, to take a second, just take a breath and take a moment, and not be reactive, right? It is very challenging sometimes for that. The other is that when there is a reaction, is to again take another breath and basically say, we're all human, we're just reacting,
Mhm.
right? But the key lesson that I really try to remember is that we all kind of have to get in a problem solving mindset
Mm.
instead of a blame shifting kind of mindset.
Yeah, that's great.
It applies not just the work that we do, but just in general, like in life, right? Um, yeah, that's a big one. And something that I learned from a mentor, Dr. Luis Corver, during the time at Fletcher School. They were involved with coaching us some. One of the things that she also said was, Dea, you have to always inject humor. Humor is a big, big, important thing to inject. And I know, of course, there's a lot of serious things going on. Absolutely. And they are serious things and serious matters. But for us humans, we have to we have to be able to make it digestible. And so, injecting some humor, especially
Mhm.
in those high pressure moments, is so essential.
Yeah, I
Um,
definitely
yeah,
agree.
there's a lot, but those are, I would say those are the two big nuggets for me,
Mhm.
at least at this point in time. It might be different,
Mhm.
or maybe next year.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Speaking of the future, I guess where do you kind of see your career in like 5, 10 years?
Um, Very great question. I'm also learning in terms of career. At the end of the day, it's a balance, right?
Mhm.
Not just for women, but for men as well.
Mhm.
So in I'm actually trying to read up and spend some time, even at this point in my career, in my life, in terms of designing my life,
Mm.
right? And that's going to look different for everyone, because number one, your particular setup, whether it's your family or whatever, right? It's going to be different, and you're a different person. I'm a different person, right?
Mhm.
So it's a bit of a long-winded response, but I guess what I'm trying to say is in 5 to 10 years, right now, as I approach, I'm a couple of years away from being 50. I am again reassessing what are the priorities of my life. My daughter is 8 at this time. So I want to continue to be available for her, but at the same time, I want to continue pursuing the best and the most that I can, right? Even in my career. So um, definitely would still want to push myself further into leadership positions.
Wow.
Continue to seek out opportunities either in higher management, executive management, and or if I find the right opportunity and fit, probably go back to more of an entrepreneurial um, pursuit.
Mhm.
So it's not clear in terms of very specific that is, but I do know the direction that I want to go. Um,
Yeah.
and it's, always higher. You have to reach for the skies.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
How have you seen like your industry change too? And how do you think it'll change also in the next 5 to 10 years?
Great question. When I got started in my career in international shipping and logistics, not to say that there weren't any women, because there were,
Mm.
but not a lot. Um, and also not in certain specific roles. So, for example, with me in a chartering, capacity and in, trading, I use the word trading for as it's brokering. Um, there were not a lot of women that would, filled the role. There are more now. In fact, the company that I'm working with now, D-Ship, which is a German firm,
Mhm.
you know, I would say about from a commercial chartering capacity, probably half of us are women. So that's pretty
Wow.
great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Um, what I would like to see more though, quite frankly, not just in our industry and just in general, are executive leadership positions
Mhm.
for women and especially for women of color. Um, you know, there are definitely a lot of companies out there still that when you look at their executive management, it's not diverse
Mm.
by any means, right? So I think sometimes, when you talk to me about 5 to 10 years, those are the things that I continue to push for with myself and my peers. I also have wonderful girlfriends that are very much driven in that way. So it has changed. I recently attended a networking event supposedly for young shipping professionals. I never attended before because I told my colleague, I said, well, I think it's supposed to be 30 and below, and
Wow.
haven't been that in a while. So, but anyway, my colleague said, well, there's, we are the young ones, in the still. And so I went and attended, and I saw definitely a more, at least for the younger generation, people that have recently graduated from supply chain
Mm.
management, more women, more diversity. And I am so, it is so good to see that, right? Because for when I got started in the industry, I mean, I would travel, and there have been countries where people look because they're not used to seeing you, sort of a thing. So
Yeah,
yeah, so
it's
it's
definitely
changing, the landscape is changing. But I also think because of the pandemic and the whole focus on supply chain in general, I think people never really thought about it. It wasn't a, excuse my language, it wasn't a sexy job, right? Like logistics and traffic and logistics wasn't really what people aspired for or really thought about, because a lot of this work is again involved in infrastructure building. But it's interesting to me now that, and again, highlighted by current events with the pandemic and supply chain issues, there's a shift in that focus and that mentality. So yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's great, like especially because you have a daughter as well. Just like giving her, hopefully, like when she enters like the business world or like whatever job she wants to get into, like this isn't really an issue anymore. But
Yes, yes. And those are one of the things that I really, I really, it keeps me going, it
mm,
keeps me aspiring for um for pushing. It's really for the younger generation, and for my daughter, most definitely,
yeah,
because I've experienced the challenges um,
mm,
that comes along with that, but even with my son too,
mm,
right? So he's in a workforce now. So I know that for him, he is slowly, of course, things have changed as well, right?
mm,
Um, from 18, 20 years ago, but there are still challenges out there when it comes to diversity um, and roles and positions that are readily, uh, not readily available, but I would say just equally available, right?
mm,
so so yeah, um yeah,
that's great.
it's definitely in the forefront of my mind. Yeah.
Mhm. So kind of shifting over like away from your corporate career, but more about to like your musical career. So could you tell us just a little bit more about your band? Like how I know obviously how you guys came together, but kind of how it continued on like during college and afterwards and stuff like that.
Yeah. So well, yeah. So it started in college,
Hmm.
and you know, my all of my bandmates at the time, they were. I mean, we were all in school. So a couple of them were actually in engineering. One of them was in psychology. I was in business.
Hmm.
Uh, we were. We loved it. We were dedicated. There's definitely work ethic in it, even though it you know very much artistic in nature, and we love that. But the discipline is there, right? So we rehearsed, um, regularly, right? And then we thankfully had such great opportunities that in terms of again, the challenges of diversity and representation, we felt that because we were predominantly an Asian American band.
Hmm.
We had, one Italian guy, but essentially we would go to the different live venues here in Houston at the time, and they would look at us and they were like, I mean, quite frankly, they were like, can they play? Are they good? You know? Um, Apparently we were because we ended up thankfully I don't know if you're familiar with
Hmm.
this artist, but we were fortunate enough to open for some major national artists like uh, Sting,
Hmm.
Alicia Keys,
Yeah, yeah.
um, and the big one, of course, for us at least, was in 2001. We ended up touring nationwide in 11 cities for Sade uh,
Mm.
in India. So we got to experience that, which was really, really amazing. Hard work, by the way, but really amazing. Um, and again, in terms of just life and events affecting our lives every day. We were in the middle of a tour, in fact, and we were exhausted because we are driving. The big stars are flying, or have a wonderful, nice tour bus going here and there, and we're
Yeah.
trucking around with a U-Haul and all this stuff. And we were very, very tired. So I couldn't even remember where we were when this happened, but we were in the middle of the tour, and the September 11 attacks
Hmm.
transpired. And so I remember we were walked into a McDonald's, and they had one of those old school, square boxy television sets on the counter
Hmm.
when that happened. And it's so sad, right? And
Hmm.
unfortunate, but obviously we, the rest of the tour was canceled because of that.
Hmm.
Um, which for us was unfortunate, but minuscule considering the tragic
Yeah, yeah.
of but yeah, no, it certainly impacted us, right? So
Mhm.
so yeah, no, that was great fun there. And then uh after those tours, we were offered some other opportunities in New York to do some shows, which unfortunately we really couldn't afford to do, nor could we accommodate, because at that point we had graduated college, and
Yeah.
we're like, oh, well, we now really have to sort of focus on the
Yeah.
work that were our careers, because we have to be able to pay rent, right?
Yes, yes.
And so we kind of let those go, and then we disbanded because we
Mhm.
were we were like, oh, we just got to focus on our livelihood. um
Mhm.
and so after that, for many, many years, we actually didn't, you know well, they did, actually. The rest of the guys in the band, they went on and did that. um I was a single mom, and so I really chose to focus on my son and my career,
Mhm.
just, as a priority, right? And so,
Yes.
so I did let go of music for many years, and it wasn't until, um, I would say a little bit before the pandemic in 2019 that I kind of started dabbling with it again. And then of course the pandemic arrested that, and we
Yes.
actually tried to do online writing music remotely. It's a bit challenging for sure. So we've just recently picked it up again. So it's great fun. Yeah. Super excited.
Mm.
And again, in terms of just personal, you say 5, 10 years, what do you see? And again, part of the journey and learning about ourselves is what keeps us, what truly makes us happy and keeps us going. So,
Mm. Yeah.
um, you know, yeah. So aside from pushing for my career, I make time for music now. Um,
Yeah, that's really
again,
cool.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, back then in college, like how did you guys come up with the name of your band even?
Actually, the name was already, by the time I joined them,
Oh.
it was already put together.
Mhm.
But it was called Fuzz,
Yeah, yeah.
PHE. And the guys in the band, came up with that name.
Mm.
Um, so there's funny stories about it.
Yes.
Just as you would imagine, a bunch of college kids would put
Mhm.
together. But yeah, but we had great fun and wonderful experiences. We were featured on PBS.
Mhm.
We were yeah, it's kind of just, especially being young, it's kind of funny, just seeing yourself on TV or or on a newspaper, and things like that. Um, it's nice to be featured and represented and acknowledged, because it's a lot of work. I think artists in general, artists know this, right? It is a labor of love. There's a lot of hours,
Mhm.
a lot of dedication, a lot of yourself, and being open to critique. um, there's a lot that goes into the work of an artist, a lot.
Yeah. Mhm.
So yeah, so that's also why I'm such a huge proponent for the arts, aside from the fact that I'm an artist myself. But yeah, I have great respect for the dedication of artists.
Mm.
Yeah.
How would you describe like the music that Fuzz produces, or like why is it especially unique?
Oh, at the time, well, first of all the members had their own musical preference. So
Mhm.
when you put together musicians that enjoy different types of music, and naturally what's going to come together is just kind of an amalgamation of things, right? It's going to be like a very mixed
Mhm.
influence of different things. um, and then so that's one. So basically the input, right, of all what we enjoy are very varied. Like for example, for me, growing up in Manila, some of the time I actually listened to a lot of jazz, and I basically like not rock and roll, you know. So the music that I was influenced by and brought
Mhm.
into the fold was very different from my bandmates. um so in terms of sound, when you ask about what it sounded like during the time, these days, I think musically, it's almost expected that there's a bit of a mishmash. Like even if you listen to country music now, there's some R&B, some hip hop, there's some, maybe even alternative going on in there in country music, you
Mhm.
know. back then it wasn't quite like that. So we had a challenging time describing our music because there was a lot of down tempo and trip hop and um, just a big mixture of influences, rock and roll, alternative, so um, that's pretty much, and then electronica, right? Electronic music. And in 2001 in Houston, Texas, especially for a live band, because, being on back then, at least a lot of live bands were, doing covers, right? Like original music is really challenging. So, so the music that we had is a mixture of all that. It was electronic, it was, R&B alternative. You know, I think it depending on who's listening and how they, what they gravitate towards, they might describe it that way. So some people have said, oh, it's R&B, and it's not entirely R&B. So yeah.
What is your personal favorite Fuzz song, and like why is that your favorite?
Oh gosh, good question. This one of the songs that so I was the main lyricist of the band, so there's a lot of storytelling, a lot of experiences, and maybe even processing, just how artists are. That's what they do, they process through their craft. But this song, Do You, is probably my favorite, and it's because it's for me, it's a reminder of just slowing down and enjoying what is present. And I say this because I am very challenged with that. So I tend to have a difficult time slowing down and just kind of savoring the moment. So in writing that song is kind of a constant reminder of that, being mindful. And it's interesting because during the pandemic times, I think in general as a population, I think we all kind of been on that a little bit, right? Is being more mindful and being more present and being, enjoying what is there. So yeah.
So I don't want to take up too much of your time tonight. I know you're super busy. Would you be okay if we did like a follow-up interview sometime, just like continuing to talk about like your band and your community involvement? There's just like so many things, insights that you have from your life. Would that be okay? Yeah, of course. Yeah, I don't want to keep you. I know you probably have to get dinner or something, but I'll definitely reach out and we can set up another time to like discuss. It'll just be like an hour and a half-ish. But everything that like you've said today has been very insightful, and we really appreciate like just sharing your memories from your life and your experiences for our archive.
Oh, thank you so much, Vivian. I am very honored. Thank you very much, and thank you to Suman and Kevin as well. It's a delight for me. So, you're such a wonderful interviewer as well. So
thank you.
It really made it such a nice experience for me as well. So I'm honored. I'm here to share because hopefully they are insightful, and hopefully they are helpful, and for especially for the future generation.
Yeah, they definitely are. So yeah, I'll just reach out to you about a follow-up interview. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording before I forget.
Sure.